Okay, thanks for joining us, everyone. This is an Extreme Heat Network webinar. And again, this is started up through a NOAA grant through CLIMAS at the University of Arizona. And we started it off with different communities in the Southwest. And one of the things that they kept asking was just to connect them with kind of what other cities across the country were doing with extreme heat. So they're kind of planning and response efforts for it. So I'm very excited because we have Daphne Lundy today with the City of New York, New York City, who is going to talk about some of their efforts. And she and I have been in touch about extreme heat for a while, so I think she's going to have some really good information to share with everyone. They definitely have a different perspective on extreme heat with their large and big building stock that's a little bit different than some of the cities that we work with in the Southwest. Just a couple of reminders for logistics. Keep your webcams and microphones turned off. We're kind of bootstrapping this off of the Zoom system at the U of A, and so keep those off and we'll get through the webinar, and then afterwards we'll have Q&A. If you do have questions for Daphne, please type them into the Zoom chat box, which you can open by pressing Alt-H, or you can kind of scroll down and it's on the bottom part of the screen for Zoom. And I'll moderate those questions and ask her verbally. And then we will record this presentation and we'll post it because we have quite a few partners who can't make the times when everyone else can. And so we'll make sure that this webinar is posted so that they can take a look at it later. And with that, I'll turn it over to Daphne Lundy, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency. Daphne?
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. I think for some background, before I started at the Mayor's Office of Resiliency, a lot of my work program was based in neighborhood planning, particularly in the floodplain. So as I've transitioned over to MRR, it's been great to talk to folks like you, folks like Lad in the Southwest, where heat is sort of more front and center. So very happy to be part of this network and continue with sharing. So for some background on what MRR does, our office is basically tasked with using the best available climate science that we have to develop programs and policies that support New Yorkers as well as sister agencies in this work of climate adaptation. Even though we were originally created in response to Hurricane Sandy, our work is far beyond the scope of just flood risk. I'm part of the social resiliency team, and our focus is really about strengthening community-based organizations so they are best able to adapt to climate risk. We're also tasked with implementing and coordinating the city's heat adaptation plan, which I'll talk about today. And we also do a lot of data analysis on urban heat island effect. Next slide, please. So, you know, as I mentioned, we started out after Hurricane Sandy, and I think that's often the risk that people think of, but we as a city face more than just flooding risk. And when we look into the future, based on data that we have from the New York City Panel on Climate Change, we're dealing with a future that's going to be warmer and wetter, where essentially all types of weather events are going to be more extreme. Next slide, please. And when it comes to heat specifically, New York City's future is one where we're expecting about triple the number of days over 90 degrees. And it's going to be more of weather akin to a lot of southern cities like Alabama. The map on the right is a New York City thermal imagery map. I'm sure as this group knows, neighborhood and building characteristics, such as impervious surface, dark roofs, and even traffic congestion can really exacerbate heat-related risk. Given the scale of New York City, we're about 300 square miles, there's pretty significant variation in surface temperature across the region. And the huge hotspot that you see in the far bottom right of the map is JFK Airport. So something that we're also grappling with is the ways in which certain parts of our city's infrastructure and industrial uses have higher surface temperature because of the heat waste being generated. Next slide, please. So a big thing that we grapple with as a city is the fact that our building stock is pretty old and it's pretty dense. And many of the buildings that we have today will continue to exist in the future where we expect higher temperatures. During extreme heat days, indoor temperatures can be as much as 20 degrees higher than outdoor temperatures without AC. And so a lot of our work is trying to figure out ways to create new regulations, not just for new construction, but for existing buildings with the eye of how to best retrofit them to accommodate this future heat risk. Next slide, please. And so in New York City, a lot of what we've faced in terms of heat mortality is associated with our building stock and also underlying inequality in the city. And this is particularly true for elderly New Yorkers. On average, there are about 450 heat-related ER visits each year and a little over 100 deaths from heat-related illness during the summer. And so, because we have this clear relationship between heat-related mortality and public health, we really wanted to use this as the foundation to understand what geographies we should be focusing our efforts on when trying to adapt for heat risk. Next slide, please. And so for a lot of our work around heat risk, we use the Heat Vulnerability Index, HVI. The HVI was created in partnership with the New York City Department of Health and Columbia University. And it's a tool that basically combines social and environmental factors to determine relative risk of different New York City neighborhoods during extreme heat events. And we added the social factors into the framing because, I'm sure as this group knows, there's this clear correlation between environmental and social factors. Because of historical historical policies, oftentimes with, racist implications in the past, we do have this long history of neglect in terms of low-income communities, particularly low-income communities of color. And the residents of disadvantaged neighborhoods often face greater health challenges to begin with. So during extreme heat events, that risk is just exacerbated. And similarly, because of histories of disinvestment in things like trees and open space, a lot of our low-income communities, particularly communities of color, have smaller tree canopies and thus higher concentrations of impervious pavement, which make them more at risk for higher surface temperatures. Next slide, please. And so in response to the city's heat risk, in 2017, we launched Cool Neighborhoods. And it was basically the city's first attempt at creating a heat adaptation strategy. And the intent of the program was really to connect the health data and the climate data that we have to achieve more equitable outcomes around New York City's climate goals. And the work was sort of framed with the following design principles. Namely, protecting and preparing New Yorkers with a particular focus on vulnerable populations and underserved communities. Next slide, please. And a major part of the work of Cool Neighborhoods was increasing green infrastructure in our high HVI neighborhoods. And so, over the past 20 or so years, the city has had a number of tree planting initiatives, but through Cool Neighborhoods, it was really our first attempt at making targeted investment in heat vulnerable neighborhoods. And so this series of photos just highlights some of the ways we've been able to increase tree canopy over the past couple of years. Next slide, please. And we've also worked with key community-based partners and folks that work in vulnerable communities. And the reason why we tried to create these partnerships is because oftentimes community-based health workers are on the ground and they're the first responders when it comes to reaching vulnerable populations. And because they already have these relationships, they are great messengers for climate risk communication. And so in coordination with our health department, we worked out a curriculum for home health aides and community health workers to train them on how to identify early signs of heat illness. Next slide, please. And we also launched the Be a Buddy Network, which is essentially a network of community-based organizations in some of the high HVI neighborhoods. And similar to the training that we did with the health workers, we use the networks of CBOs as a way to train folks in climate preparedness, so they're also equipped to reach out to neighbors or folks who are socially isolated in their communities during climate events. And so leading up to a heat wave, we do a lot of work through social media. So the image on the right is an example of something that we've tweeted out leading up to a heat wave. And we've also done work with local radio stations to get the word out. Next slide, please. Over the past decade, we've been expanding the number of cool roofs, white roofs, in the city. And in 2018, the first year after we officially launched Cool Roofs, we were able to expand cool roofs to about 73% of geographies that were HVI 4 and 5. So it basically meant that we were able to increase the square footage of cool roofs in these high heat and vulnerable areas. And again, the city has had a number of initiatives around increasing white roofs over the course of the past couple of years, but this was the first attempt at targeting neighborhoods that we know experience heat vulnerability. Next slide, please. And we've also taken special care to target our public housing stock. Public housing in the city represents a pretty major component of our residential building stock. And so this is just an example of a NYCHA campus that we coated with the cool roof. Next slide, please. And so during heat emergencies, New York City Emergency Management does a lot of coordinating with sister agencies to spread the words through radio, media, and stuff like that. They are also the ones that activate the cooling center map. So it's a map that shows the location of all cooling centers throughout the city. So cooling centers in New York City are typically libraries, senior centers, community centers. Since the buildings can oftentimes look different and are pretty varied, about 2 years ago, emergency management took on an effort to sort of standardize the signage, make sure that it was in multiple languages. So regardless of the use of the site during non-heat wave times, people knew that senior centers or community centers were available to them as spaces of respite and for cooling. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's a pretty significant difference in surface temperature throughout the city, and because of sort of, neighborhood and building characteristics. And so to that end, we've been coordinating an indoor and outdoor temperature monitoring network to get a better sense of what that temperature differential actually looks like. I think something that Lad and I have talked about in the past is the challenge of communicating heat risk, because it's oftentimes invisible. It's not like a flooding event where you see a damaged building or you see something sort of shut down. And so our use of sensors is a way of getting at a data point or a metric that helps to create the case of the heat risk and the need for cooling interventions in general. Next slide, please. And we've also been working to update our buildings regulations to encourage more green infrastructure and reduce urban heat hazards, while also trying to achieve the citywide goals around decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. And in New York City, it's a pretty big deal because buildings account for about 2/3 of the city's greenhouse gas emissions. And so this year, the city enacted local laws 92 and 94, and it basically requires that all new buildings or buildings that are undergoing major renovations be covered with solar panels, green roofs, or some sort of combination of the two. Because of this policy, we are expecting over 1 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2030, and up to 1 million additional gallons of stormwater managed every year. Next slide, please. We've had regulations on the books for quite a number of years to try to encourage building scale strategies for heat risk. In 2012, New York City adopted the Zone Green Text Amendment. And the text basically allowed for upgrades to buildings to improve insulation, which then improves energy efficiency. We also allowed for sun control devices like louvers, screens on the building facades. And we also allowed for solar panels and green roofs as permitted obstructions on roofs. Next slide, please. So since Zone Green was enacted, the city's been working with the Urban Green Council to sort of take stock at how effective the regulations have been, and with the goal of creating future updates to, again, encourage more people to take on these sort of resiliency improvements in the future. And we're particularly focused on upgrades to allow for facade replacements, because again, for us, the issue is the age of building stock, and so we want to sort of create avenues for existing buildings to retrofit. Next slide, please. We've also been working on creating a series of climate resiliency design guidelines with a particular focus on city facilities. And so we wanted to look at city facilities because given the cost oftentimes involved with upgrading or developing them, and the fact that they typically have a long life, we wanted to make sure that climate resiliency was integrated into the design process, and to make sure that heat risk was being addressed. And some of the strategies that we've recommended for city facilities include things like increasing solar reflectance of surfaces, increasing shading and porosity around the facility, and working to reduce or capture waste heat from the AC or other mechanical systems. You know, as I mentioned on the thermal imagery map, a lot of our city's industrial areas or working industrial areas are oftentimes major generators of heat waste. And so this set of design guidelines is one way that we're trying to give those types of facilities avenues for retrofitting. Next slide, please. And so here are some of additional recommendations that are outlined in the report. The full report is available online, but basically we want designers and developers of buildings to sort of focus on two aspects when it comes to heat. The way their project increases or reduces urban heat island effect, as well as the impact that rising temperatures will have on the actual functionality of the site. And more broadly, we want to make sure that the projects are again designed to withstand future climate conditions in general. And so the guidelines also provide climate data that you know, developers or architects can plug into a sort of checklist to make sure that they're addressing these future risks into the design of the building. Next slide, please. I wanted to include some resources that we've found helpful. These are all available online, but we've found them to be sort of helpful guides in how we're thinking about existing regulations, but also ways that we want to improve them in the future. Next slide, please. So that's all I have. This is my contact information. Feel free to reach out, but I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Daphne. You're very inspirational, and I know the work that you've done, a lot of cities are looking at as kind of a model for them to follow too, related to heat risk. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Again, if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box. I have a couple to start us off with. Daphne, you read my mind, because one of the questions I was going to ask is how you communicate the heat risk. And so you already mentioned that the sensors have been kind of a useful way for the city to talk about heat risk. Are there any other strategies that you found is kind of a helpful way for cities to talk about heat risk compared with other more visible risks like flooding?
You know, I think trying to connect the heat risk to the human factor has been really helpful for us. I think it's sort of a hard topic to talk about, but I think when we help people understand that heat risk is responsible for more mortality than hurricanes, it's really surprising to people because, again, with a hurricane, you see destruction of property, of facilities, stuff like that. But during heat waves, you see loss of life. And so I think that framing, that reminder has been a helpful way for us to talk about vulnerability in the city, particularly as it relates to our elderly, low-income folks in the city, stuff like that.
Great, thank you. Another question is, New York City obviously has a pretty complex governance structure and a pretty highly resourced city, but who have been some of your partners in heat planning that other cities could look at partnering with, kind of interagency partnerships or collaborations?
Yeah, so our office actually does a lot of work with the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, MOS. They're really tasked with helping us reach our greenhouse gas emission goals in terms of lowering them. And so they do a lot of work around building mandates, figuring out ways to support energy retrofits. So they've been a great ally in that work. I know in the past we've done a number of workshops and charrettes with AIA New York, the American Institute of Architects. So they've been a great forum for convening built environment professionals like architects, designers, to start thinking about ways to upgrade buildings, retrofit buildings, stuff like that, with a particular lens around heat risk. And also, one of the reports I had on the slide was through the Urban Land Institute, so ULI. As you know, Lad, you've been involved in a lot of that work as well. They've been a great partner in, again, sharing best practices to people working in like the built environment policy world.
Okay, great. Let's see, I have two questions here. So one is, would a 2 to 3 week in advance probabilistic forecast of heat wave help resilience? So kind of a question about, for climate providers, basically, would knowing a heat wave is coming 2 to 3 weeks in advance, would that help the city with some of their response efforts?
That's a great question. I think that could be an interesting strategy, if only because we at least for hurricanes, we have a lot more lead time often. And so to the extent possible that we can be giving people early warning through the science, I think that would help with the messaging, and also making sure that you know, folks who may not have access to AC know where to go, or they know to stay with friends or family that have air conditioning, stuff like that. So I think, yeah, I think that could be an interesting approach.
Okay. One more question. Does New York City provide any incentives or programs that encourage developers to go above and beyond the minimum cooling requirements that you guys have set?
Yeah, so right now, the way our regulations are written, we have a lot of mandates around heating in the winter, but we don't have that similar type of language when it comes to cooling or requiring cooling. You know, for most developments, there's oftentimes requirements for street trees, stuff like that. And also new construction is required to have the white roof or the green roof. But I don't think to date there's been that direct sort of ask of developers. The Office of Resiliency runs the Retrofit Accelerator program. And so that is a program that's available for free for property owners looking to make retrofit upgrades. So I think a lot of our sort of support to date has been on the technical side of just helping walk people through how to do retrofits, or what a retrofit menu would look like for their building.
Okay. Another question is, are the indoor temperature monitors you mentioned used for data collection, or are they also used to alert residents or caregivers about dangerous temperatures?
So the indoor monitors that we use are pretty simple. So it's primarily for data collection. The same thing with the outdoor monitors, but I think in a future version, if we were able to use sort of more sophisticated sensors, that could be an interesting model as well. Right now the city has an emergency warning system called Notify NYC, and it basically sends text messages and emails to people, warning them of different types of risk. But obviously for older residents who may not have access to email or may not be as versed, we're always trying to figure out new ways to reach them, which is why we do a lot of work with local radio stations and also local news stations to spread the word.
Okay. Another question is, I asked who you partner with across the city. This question is, how do you actually coordinate that work? So obviously large kind of complex institution with lots of nonprofits and other community groups involved. So how do you coordinate all of this work and make it cohesive?
Yeah, I think because the Cool Neighborhoods approach was fairly novel since it was the first heat adaptation plan. A lot of the work has been done through pilots, and then once there's proof of concept, figuring out ways to expand. And so, for example, the Be a Buddy program is currently being piloted in only a handful of CBOs, but the goal is that once folks are trained up and they've gone through sort of the experience of a couple of summers, that program is then replicable to more CBOs in the future. But that's really been the approach, sort of piloting a lot of the initiatives in key geographies and then figuring out ways to expand it once we have proof of effectiveness, proof of concept.
Okay, great. And last question for you today. If for the cities and the planners that are on the webinar kind of watching and listening, are there any low-hanging fruits that you would recommend, kind of having gone through so many different pilot projects and policy initiatives in New York City? Are there any low-hanging fruits that you would recommend other cities kind of look at as first steps?
Yeah, I think that the communications piece is really crucial when we think about heat resiliency. There have been a number of studies, I don't know if they're New York City specific, but basically showing that for older residents, there's oftentimes like a cognitive dissonance between their actual physical vulnerability and how they perceive themselves or don't perceive themselves to be vulnerable. And so we can think about strategies in terms of sort of crafting communications to make sure that we're actually reaching the right audiences. The example that Kizzy Charles Guzman, the director of my team, uses is that if you looked at weather, like heat wave announcements a couple years ago, if it was a news clip, you'd probably see a young woman in her 20s in a sports bra jogging in a park. And that is not the demographic that's often the most at risk during heat waves. And so if we're thinking about how to reach the vulnerable people in our communities, we have to make sure that we're messaging appropriately to them. And that could be as simple as knowing to reach out to, again, local radio stations, knowing to reach out to local news avenues in general, stuff like that. But that's really been, I think, a key focus of our work, just making sure that we're actually communicating the risk to the right audience.
Great, thank you so much, Daphne, and thank you again for the time and sharing all of the initiatives that you've been a part of at New York City. Just to wrap things up, for everyone that's new to the webinar, you see a couple of new names on the list. Go to heat.arizona.edu and you can subscribe for future webinar updates, or you can just email me at ladd@arizona.edu. And again, we really thank Daphne for her time today, and we'll send out an email shortly with news of our next webinar that's coming up in October. So thanks for joining us, everyone.
Great, thanks for having me.